Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. In the small countryside stretch of land known as Maple Hollow, where the trees murmured secrets and time moved like molasses on cold mornings, there lived a woman whose silence wrapped around her like a worn shawl. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and the villagers often said she had the patience of a nun and the eyes of someone who had seen too much, too young. Her home, a two-story white brick cottage framed by wild roses and a moss-covered fence, sat quietly at the edge of Hollow Creek Road, not far from the chapel that chimed on Sundays, but rang hollow most other days. Clara's days began before the rooster crowed, and her hands moved like poetry through soil and stone as she nursed her garden, not for beauty, but for solace. To anyone looking in from the outside, her life appeared charmed, a devoted wife, a beautiful home, a peaceful town where everyone nodded politely and asked about your mother's health even if they didn't care. But beneath the calm lay waters deeper than they dared to guess. People assumed Clara was just another sweet countrywoman who knew her place and played it well. But assumptions, like idle tongues, often drift far from truth. Clara was no fool. She had built her life like a lace of spider thread, delicate to the eye, deadly in design. She knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Edgar Whitmore, her husband of 12 years, was a man who wore charm like a second skin. His voice was a polished tool. He used to buy admiration in public spaces, and his gaze could warm a room or chill it, depending on what he needed. Tall, broad-shouldered, always in neatly pressed shirts and leather shoes that clicked with purpose, Edgar was Maple Hollow's prideful son. The townspeople often spoke his name with respect, though behind closed doors some whispered that his grin was a little too perfect, his words a little too smooth. He ran a small but profitable logistics firm out of Oak Ridge County, and when he wasn't overseeing operations, he was shaking hands and offering jokes in low tones that made men laugh and women blush. He came home late most nights, blaming traffic, broken shipments, or long meetings. Clara never challenged it. She kissed his cheek when he allowed it and set his dinner where it was always warm, but her eyes, those sharp, still eyes, never looked away from the truth she wasn't ready to speak. There was a time, not so long ago, when Edgar used to bring her wildflowers from roadside stands and whisper scripture to her at night like lullabies. "Two are better than one," he once told her, quoting from Ecclesiastes, "for if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow." But now his voice was hollow when he prayed, and his presence felt like a shadow on her porch, something that lingered but didn't belong. Clara had never been loud, but she had never been weak. Her strength was not the kind that shouted across fields or slammed doors. It was the kind that endured. She remembered things, not just facts or faces, but moments, subtle things that others would miss. The way Edgar avoided her eyes when he undressed. The way his phone always faced down on the nightstand. The one red hair she found on his coat, not her color, and not from her world. But she said nothing. Not yet. She tended to her routines with the care of a woman preparing for something larger than anyone suspected. Some afternoons, she would sit quietly on the porch with her Bible in her lap, letting the wind turn the pages. She didn't always read the words aloud, but she marked them. "A prudent woman foreseeth the evil, and hideth herself, but the simple pass on, and are punished." That verse from Proverbs lingered in her heart like a whisper from heaven. And still, she made his coffee just the way he liked it, 2 sugars, no cream. She laid out his clothes with military precision. She answered the door with a smile that could fool the devil himself. Because sometimes, in order to win, you must first be underestimated. Clara understood this. She moved through her days like a woman carving stone, patiently, consistently, quietly. It was in the small details where Edgar began to fail her, and it was in those same small details that Clara stored her ammunition. She never wrote anything down. She didn't confide in friends. She barely had any. Women in Maple Hollow found her too refined, too composed, and they whispered about her behind cupped hands when they passed her in the bakery. "She thinks she's better than the rest of us," they'd say. But Clara had no time for petty alliances. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and kept her thoughts like pearls hidden in the folds of her mind. On the outside, nothing changed. Edgar's absences grew more frequent. His laugh at home grew scarce. He used to hum hymns while shaving, but now the silence in their house echoed like a cathedral built for no one. Clara never searched his pockets or his drawers. She didn't have to. The truth always leaves breadcrumbs for those who know where to look, and Clara followed those crumbs with the steady hands of a surgeon. She noticed the new cologne, spiced and foreign, and how he had begun receiving calls with the door closed and the windows open. What man fears his wife hearing more than he fears the wind? One night, when he claimed to be working late, she walked down to the church just to kneel. She didn't ask for answers. She didn't ask for justice. She simply said, "Lord, tell me when it is time." And then she rose and walked home in silence, letting the night carry her prayers like arrows in the wind. Michael was not a man that most people looked at twice. He was the kind of presence that passed unnoticed unless needed, like a coat on a rainy day or an old song you didn't realize you remembered until it played. Tall, with a lean frame hardened from years of manual labor, he carried himself with the quiet posture of someone who knew better than to interrupt the world's noise with his own. His skin was weathered from the sun, the kind of brown that told stories of fields and fumes. A faded scar cut across the right side of his face like an unfinished sentence, and though he never told anyone where it came from, it was enough to stop nosy questions before they were fully formed. For nearly 7 years, he had worked as Edgar's driver, and in those years he had learned how to disappear into the background. He learned that rich men often spoke most freely when they believed no one was listening, and that women, especially ones like Clara, often said everything without opening their mouths. Michael had never been one for meddling. He believed people's lives were their own baskets to carry. But lately, the air inside that car had shifted. Edgar's tone had grown crueler, more clipped, as if the weight of some private indulgence had begun to rot his manners. His phone calls, once dull and routine, had become riddled with laughter that didn't belong to Clara, soft murmurs followed by long, guilty silences. Michael didn't need names. He recognized the cadence of betrayal, the way it leaned into its own thrill and thought itself invisible. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Edgar passed him a thick brown envelope without meeting his eyes. "Printing house on Willersby Lane," he said, like he was asking someone to fetch milk. There was no thank you, no explanation, just that arrogant air of someone convinced the world was built to serve his convenience. Michael drove off, watching the man's reflection shrink in the side mirror. He had no intention of prying, at least not at first. But as he waited in the printing house for a clerk to process the contents, something clawed at him, an itch behind the ribs, a quiet alarm that refused to be ignored. He had seen enough in his time to recognize the signs, secrecy bred from premeditation, a man too calm in the middle of his own mess. When the clerk called for a brief delay, Michael stepped outside into the alley, rainwater trailing down his neck. He looked through the building's smudged glass window, and inside he caught sight of the pages being handled, photo prints, blown-up images, figures arranged in strange positions. He didn't need to see them clearly to know something was off. That evening, long after Edgar had gone home, Michael returned to the print shop under the pretense of picking up something forgotten. The boy at the counter, barely 20 and eager for tips, hesitated only a moment before showing him the printed copies. There she was, Clara, but not as he knew her. These images told a lie he could feel in his bones, a cruel invention meant to destroy a woman whose dignity never faltered. The man in the photographs, bare-chested, partially turned, was someone Michael recognized, a local pump attendant named Ronnie, who couldn't keep a story straight if it were stitched into his sleeve. The setting was staged, the angles off, the lighting unnatural. It was all a performance, and Edgar had written the script, a script that painted Clara as a sinner, unfaithful, unclean. Michael could barely believe the gall of it. He stood in the alley for a long while, the damp night air pulling the breath from his lungs. For the first time in years, he considered quitting, walking away from the Whitmore household and everything that came with it. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was the way Clara had always treated him, not like a servant, but like a human being. She'd once made him soup when he had a cough that wouldn't leave, and she had remembered his daughter's name when she passed away, long after the town had moved on. That kind of memory sticks to a man's chest. Clara wasn't just kind, she was steady. She was the kind of woman who carried her pain quietly, not out of pride, but out of discipline. And that night, Michael made a decision he couldn't unmake. He would tell her everything. It wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about justice. It was about something older, something nobler, a refusal to let truth be buried beneath another man's selfish plot. He didn't know how she would take it. He just knew she deserved the truth before it found her the wrong way. The next day arrived with the kind of morning that smelled like damp earth and pine needles, the sun blinking shyly through a veil of fog. Michael parked the car by the Whitmore garden and waited, hands gripping the steering wheel like a confession. Clara emerged from the porch just as the clock struck 8, wearing her usual morning shawl and carrying a small tin of feed for the hens. She moved with her usual quiet grace, but even from the distance, Michael could see the sharpness in her eyes had deepened overnight. He stepped out of the vehicle before he could lose his nerve. "Ma'am," he said, voice unsure, "if you've got a minute." Clara paused, tilting her head slightly, like a bird deciding whether to fly. She walked over without a word, the sound of her footsteps muffled by dew-soaked gravel. Michael hesitated only a second longer before telling her everything, the photos, the lies, the plan Edgar had set in motion with calm, calculated steps. He watched her face for a reaction. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She simply listened, like a woman who had expected this moment to arrive not today, but someday. When he finished, breath ragged and heavy, she placed a hand gently on the fence between them. Her voice was soft when it came, but it carried the weight of thunder buried beneath velvet. "I always knew," she said, not bitter, not broken. "I just wasn't ready then." Then she turned and walked back toward her hens as if the sky hadn't just fallen. And in that moment, Michael realized something unshakable. Clara Whitmore was no stranger to storms. She had simply been waiting for the right one to bring down her house of cards. The days that followed carried a strange stillness, as if time itself had paused to witness what would unfold. Edgar, in his self-importance, believed he had set the stage perfectly. He walked through the house with new boldness, whistling under his breath as though his heart was clean and his mind at peace. He believed the shadows now worked in his favor. Having sown lies so deeply into the earth, he was convinced nothing could uproot them. He had even begun to rehearse his narrative in front of the mirror, half-pained husband, half-victim of betrayal. There was a twisted satisfaction in his manner, like a man sharpening a blade while humming at him. But what Edgar failed to see in his foolishness was that Clara had changed, not loudly, not in a way that would have alerted even the most observant eye. Her silence was no longer passive. It had taken on shape, a new weight. She moved through the house like someone preparing for winter, quietly, thoroughly, and with the kind of grace that unsettled even the walls. Each time Edgar tried to provoke her into a reaction, she simply looked at him with a calmness that chilled his marrow. Her stillness was no longer rooted in submission, it had ripened into strategy. She no longer looked like a woman wronged. She looked like a woman waiting. That was what unnerved him most. He didn't know what she was waiting for. Valerie had begun appearing more frequently, not in the open, but like a fox at dusk, quick, watchful, bold when she thought no one was looking. She was younger than Clara by a good 12 years, with bright eyes and the kind of beauty that turned heads in places where people still remembered what decency looked like. Edgar kept her tucked away in goose houses and rented rooms just outside town, as if secrecy were a game they could win with clever timing and careful lies. But even secrets have a scent. One evening, when Edgar returned home after another late business meeting, Clara greeted him with a faint smile and a plate of stew, then excused herself to sit on the porch. The moment was quiet, uneventful to the untrained eye, yet behind her calm posture, she had already begun laying the real foundation of what was to come. She had no intention of stooping to his level, no angry outbursts, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, she simply listened to the growing murmurs in town. They came slowly, like rain that begins with scattered drops. First from the baker's wife, who asked awkwardly about that situation. Then from a church elder, who offered a prayer for strength in the face of marital challenges. Clara would nod kindly, accept the words with grace, then return home and record the moment in a little black journal. Her entries were simple, factual, void of emotion, but behind each line was an unspoken vow. Edgar thought he had hidden his affair well. What he didn't realize was that every lie leaves behind a footprint, and Clara had been walking behind him for a very long time. The storm truly began the day Edgar's plan moved into its final stage. He had worked out every detail, fabricated a false timeline, rehearsed his testimony, even paid a local notary to confirm a fake date on a forged receipt. The fake affair he constructed for Clara had taken shape, fleshed out with names she never knew and places she never visited. He intended to drag her reputation through the dirt and emerge looking like a betrayed man forced into courage. What he underestimated, as most prideful men do, was Clara's restraint. The more she said nothing, the more powerful her silence became. It began to eat away at his confidence. He started watching her out of the corner of his eye, unsure if her stillness was rooted in ignorance or something far more dangerous. On one occasion he found her humming in the garden, a soft, almost holy melody that made his skin crawl. He couldn't place the tune, but it sounded familiar, like the opening to a funeral song. That night Clara sat alone in the bedroom, staring at the wall for what seemed like hours. Edgar came in, chest puffed up with false courage, and told her plainly that they'd be meeting with lawyers in a week's time. She looked up at him, gently closed the book in her lap, and simply nodded. There were no tears, no begging, no angry questions. That rattled him more than he cared to admit. A woman who doesn't cry when you expect it is either broken or dangerous, and Clara didn't look broken. Michael, in the meantime, became something of a quiet guardian. He had resumed his duties with Edgar as expected, but had taken to watching Clara from a respectful distance. He noticed how she had begun to catalog her days with precision. Who said what, where Edgar went, what time he left and returned. She never wrote anything down in front of anyone, but Michael had seen her once, late at night, at the kitchen table with pages spread out and a pen dancing across them. Her eyes weren't filled with sorrow, but calculation. There was a stillness to her that reminded Michael of a calm sea right before a storm surge. He had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather about women who didn't need to raise their voices to curse a man, women who were water, silent, cleansing, and destructive all at once. Clara reminded him of those women. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for Edgar to finish digging his own pit. Michael had once wondered why Clara hadn't defended herself in town, why she allowed the rumors to bloom. But now, watching her from the driver's seat as she walked out with her Bible each morning, he understood. Some battles aren't fought with swords, they're fought with timing. And Clara, in her eerie quiet, knew that the longer she waited, the louder her truth would speak. She was letting Edgar believe he was in control, but Michael could see now. clear as the sunrise over the hollow, that Clara had never once let go of the reins. She was holding the end of the rope, waiting for him to keep pulling, until he noosed himself with it. The weather turned before the town noticed, and with it, something shifted in the air between the walls of the Whitmore household. The once familiar rhythm of Edgar's footsteps began to falter, not because of injury or age, but because doubt had taken hold of his bones. Clara's calm had not cracked. Her quietness only deepened. She was no longer the wife he thought he knew. Where once she had been an island of obedience, now she was a mountain rooted too deep for his storms to shake. The rooms in the house began to feel different to him, colder, too quiet, too still. He thought he was controlling the tempo, that he was the conductor of this slow disintegration, but the music had changed and he couldn't follow the beat. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't even sad, and that absence of reaction dug into his pride more than any anger would have. He started second-guessing himself. At night, he would lie awake beside her while she slept, or seemed to sleep, and he'd listen to the steady rhythm of her breathing, wondering if she knew more than she let on. He began to picture her waking up after the divorce, stronger, more admired than before. That thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Men like Edgar didn't just want to be free, they wanted to be right. They wanted to be pitied. But how could he be pitied if the woman he accused refused to break? Clara moved with the measured grace of someone rearranging pieces on a board few knew existed. She made no grand declarations, no sudden changes. Yet underneath her quiet days were plans as intricate as embroidery. Each moment was stitched with intention. She began waking earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but necessity. There were calls to be made, carefully, from numbers Edgar wouldn't trace. She reached out to a woman in the neighboring town, someone whose name never came up in Maple Hollow gossip. Her name was Elsie Marin, a solicitor with a reputation for being surgical in court and stone-faced in conversation. Clara didn't tell her a sob story. She laid out facts like stones in a row, accounts Edgar had hidden, payments to a woman with no address, purchases that didn't align with his story of a loyal, overworked husband. Elsie didn't offer sympathy, and Clara didn't ask for any. They shook hands in the dark corner of a rented tea room, and Clara placed a single folder in front of her. "This," she said, "is just what I've gathered from listening." Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "I haven't even started looking." There was a certain reverence in the way Elsie picked up the folder, like a collector handed a rare piece. Clara left that meeting without haste, stopping on her way home to buy peaches from a roadside stall. To the vendor, she looked like any other housewife. She smiled, paid in exact change, and walked away with the son behind her. No one would have guessed that tucked inside her handbag were the threads of Edgar's unraveling. While Edgar prepared for the legal theater he believed he controlled, Clara continued playing her role with the elegance of someone who had lived several lives in silence. She allowed the rumors to grow around her like weeds, unbothered by the sly glances in the market or the tight smiles from church ladies who now whispered behind hymnals. She didn't correct them. She didn't defend herself. She knew the appetite of gossip was strongest when it was fed with mystery. People believe what makes them feel clever, and silence lets them fill in the gaps with their own invention. What they didn't see was Clara in her kitchen late at night, tracing Edgar's financial trail like a thread through a labyrinth. He had always underestimated her, assuming her stillness meant simplicity. But Clara had kept every receipt, every schedule, every canceled check. She had memorized the password to his business account from the day he let it slip in a drunken boast. She had even tracked the fake business expenses that led to hotels in towns they never visited together. What Edgar had forgotten, what men like him always forget, is that the woman they ignore is often the one watching most closely. Clara didn't need to invent lies about him. She just had to document the truth. And unlike him, her truth didn't need to be loud. It only needed to be provable. That was her power. Every step she took now was a quiet countdown. The final week before the hearing moved like molasses in winter. Edgar, now sure of his advantage, strutted with more arrogance than ever. He spoke to Clara like a man who had already won. "You'll see it's for the best," he said one night while eating the stew she made. "You'll have a chance to start fresh. Maybe find someone who's more your pace." She looked up from her knitting, her expression unreadable. "Maybe," she said simply, returning her eyes to the fabric. That evening, she went into the shed and brought out the ledger he had once called unnecessary. She flipped through it, page by page, highlighting every transaction that led to his personal accounts, including one labeled Client Expense, Valerie J. Her hands moved steadily, deliberately. She had even cataloged the mileage from his trips, miles logged on days he claimed to be in town. The case she was building was not built on revenge. It was built on revelation. Edgar had been trying to drag her name through the mud, but Clara intended to raise his skeleton so high that even the crows would not perch on his reputation when she was done. Michael, who had silently borne witness to her transformation, watched as Clara carried herself with a different kind of strength now. She didn't just endure, she anticipated. She wasn't weathering the storm anymore. She was steering it. And in the quiet of the house, beneath the low hum of a ticking clock, Clara folded every piece of evidence into a new envelope, sealed it, and placed it under her Bible. She whispered only one verse aloud before sleeping that night, "For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all they that wait for him." The courthouse stood at the edge of Willow Hill, an old gray building with wide pillars and windows like watching eyes. On the morning of the hearing, clouds hung low over Maple Hollow, thick and unmoved like the silence before a sermon. People had gathered quietly along the street, not in protest or celebration, but with the same curiosity that made them lean closer at funerals. Word had gotten out. Not the full truth, of course, but enough to draw interest. A few believed Clara was the one in the wrong. Some believed Edgar was hiding something, and many simply wanted to be present for the fall of someone they'd once envied. Inside the courtroom, the air was stiff and dry, held together by whispers and the occasional cough. Edgar walked in first, dressed in a navy blue suit that looked a size too proud. Beside him, Valerie followed, her heels sharp against the tile, her lips painted a shade that didn't know humility. Edgar wore confidence like a mask that morning, fixed, painted, and cracking at the edges. He looked around the courtroom as though it were a stage built for him, nodding at the judge as if he already knew how the script ended. Clara arrived 10 minutes later, walking with quiet steps, a plain dress hugging her frame and a small black clutch in her hands. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, but people turned to look anyway. There was something about her stillness that made people uncomfortable, the way her eyes didn't dart, the way her mouth didn't quiver, the way her presence demanded attention without asking for it. When called to speak, Edgar stood with the rhythm of a man who had practiced in front of a mirror. His voice was calm, almost performative, and he spoke of heartbreak, disappointment, and betrayal. He described Clara as distant, cold, emotionally absent. He gestured at the printed photographs as if they were sacred proof, artifacts of a wounded husband's sorrow. "I did everything I could to save our marriage," he said, with a pause perfectly placed for sympathy. "But I cannot live with lies. I refuse to be the man who sacrifices himself for someone who has already left him in every way that matters." A hush fell over the room. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, scanning the pages handed to him. Clara sat unmoving, her hands gently folded in her lap. She didn't look at Edgar, nor did she glance at the photos. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge's bench like a lighthouse locked on a distant ship. When her name was called, she stood slowly, her movements smooth but deliberate, like a tree bending in the wind, not breaking. She did not begin with emotion. She did not raise her voice. "I will not defend myself with noise," she said softly, "but I will present the truth." She walked forward and laid down a folder. Nothing flashy, no drama, no grand performance. Just a folder, thick and worn at the edges, its contents quiet and unassuming. She turned back and spoke only what was necessary. Not opinion, not reaction. Just facts, time-stamped bank records, hotel receipts, audio transcriptions, and sworn statements. With each word, the foundation of Edgar's story trembled. As the judge flipped through the documents, his expression changed from distant curiosity to focused scrutiny. One by one, the pieces Clara had so patiently gathered took shape in his hands. There was an audio recording, Edgar's voice, unmistakably his, speaking carelessly on the phone with Valerie, about how Clara'll never see it coming. That phrase landed in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Valerie shifted in her seat, her earlier smirk now contorted into discomfort. Clara didn't gloat, didn't glance their way, didn't so much as breathe heavier. She simply stepped back, allowing the weight of evidence to do what screams could never achieve. Her lawyer, Elsie Marin, stood then and filled in what needed to be said, connecting the dots with surgical precision. She revealed Edgar's misappropriation of funds from his own business, payments listed under false accounts, romantic trips disguised as company expenses. One by one, the illusions Edgar had stacked were stripped bare. Valerie, now visibly tense, leaned toward Edgar and whispered something urgent, but he ignored her, eyes frozen on the judge's face. For the first time, the courtroom no longer felt like a stage. It felt like judgment. And Clara, standing in the quiet eye of that storm, remained untouched. She had never needed to shout. She had never needed to plead. She had brought only the truth, wrapped in patience and protected by time. The ruling didn't come immediately, but the shift in energy was undeniable. The judge, after a brief recess, returned with a tone that carried no room for pretense. Edgar's claims were dismissed. Clara's countersuit was accepted for review, citing fraudulent evidence, emotional distress, and financial deception. Valerie stood, gathering her purse like a woman escaping a burning house. She didn't look at Clara. She didn't look at Edgar. She simply walked out, her heels now muffled, as if the ground itself no longer wanted to echo her presence. Edgar remained seated, stunned, the world he'd built on deception collapsing in the silence of consequence. Clara exited the courtroom without haste. She walked down the courthouse steps with Michael waiting by the car, the envelope of evidence still clutched in her hand. She did not weep. She did not laugh. She looked up at the gray sky and took a slow breath, the kind one takes when stepping into air that is finally their own. Michael opened the door for her, but before stepping in, she turned and took one last look at the building behind her. There was no triumph in her eyes, only peace. She whispered a verse under her breath, not for others to hear, but for herself alone. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. Her battle had never been about vengeance. It had been about truth. And now that it had spoken, she had no desire to linger. The days that followed were marked not by celebration, but by quiet restoration. Clara did not dance in the streets, nor host luncheons for the townspeople who had once whispered behind her back. She had no desire to be praised or pitied. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontations with those who'd misjudged her. Instead, she returned to her routine with the same grace she had always carried, as though nothing extraordinary had happened, though everything had changed. The shutters on her home, once forest green and dulled by age, were painted a soft blue, like a gentle declaration of a life renewed. Each morning she swept the porch and watered the roses, not for the sake of appearance, but because it grounded her. The house was hers now, not just in name, but in spirit. Edgar had vanished from the hollow like fog at sunrise. His name still echoed in some corners, carried in lowered voices and unfinished sentences, but Clara paid it no mind. She had never sought to erase him, only to remove his shadow from her light. There was no bitterness in her air, only the scent of peace, and a stillness that could not be stolen again. She moved through each room like someone reacquainting herself with space, reclaiming the silence, adjusting the frames, placing her books where they belonged. She had not been waiting for this freedom. She had been preparing for it. Michael remained at her side, not as a servant, but as a steady presence, part driver, part companion, and part silent witness to a victory most would never fully understand. He came by each morning, parked under the chestnut tree, and carried out his small duties without intrusion. He knew Clara valued solitude, but he also knew solitude need not mean isolation. Sometimes they shared coffee on the porch, speaking of nothing in particular, letting the hours pass like old friends watching the road unwind beneath the wind. On one such morning, Michael turned to her, his voice cautious, almost shy in its curiosity. "You really knew all that time?" She didn't look at him right away. Instead, she watched a butterfly land on the rim of her teacup, its wings flickering like flame. "I knew," she said softly. "But knowing and acting aren't the same. Timing is its own kind of power." Her gaze didn't drift with the butterfly. It stayed firm. "I could have torn him down the first time he betrayed me, but sometimes a structure has to weaken on its own. You don't knock down a rotting barn. You wait until it can't stand anymore. Then you push with one finger." Michael nodded, understanding more than he could express. He had worked for men like Edgar. He had seen what cruelty looked like when it wore perfume and carried promises, but he had never seen anyone dismantle such a lie with such unwavering stillness. Clara's strength had never come from vengeance. It had come from restraint, and now that restraint had become her peace. The townspeople, who once looked at Clara with sideways glances and hushed condescension, began to regard her differently, not with pity or remorse, but with something closer to reverence. They could not quite place what had changed about her, only that she now walked with the weight of someone who had survived fire and didn't carry the scent of ash. Some tried to apologize, though few found the right words. A handful left pies or preserves at her doorstep, small offerings wrapped in shame and uncertainty. Clara accepted them all with the same quiet smile and never once brought up the past. Her forgiveness wasn't spoken, it was simply lived. At church, she sat in the third pew instead of the back, her Bible open, her hands still. She no longer needed to shrink. Children, sensing her calm, often gravitated toward her after service, asking simple questions or just sitting near her skirt hem. She became something of a myth in Maple Hollow, not because she had done something extraordinary, but because she had endured without turning to stone. Her dignity had not been loud, but it had endured like iron beneath velvet. One morning, while trimming back her jasmine vine, she found a note slipped through the fence, unsigned, hurriedly written. "I was wrong about you," it read. She folded it once, placed it in her apron pocket, and returned to her pruning. She had no intention of displaying such notes or building monuments of apology. Truth, once known, didn't require banners. It simply required remembering. One evening, just as the sun began its slow descent into the hills, Clara stood alone in the backyard beneath the old cedar tree Edgar had once promised to cut down, and never did. She looked up at its branches, then down at her hands. The wind moved through her hair like an old friend, and for the first time in many years, her heart felt still, not like a locked door, but like a room that had been swept clean and opened to fresh air. She thought of all the years she had held herself in, curled her thoughts into silence, pressed her heartbreak between pages only she would ever read. And now, none of it needed to be voiced. What had once been a wound had become wisdom. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the small piece of paper with the final ledger figures, evidence she had never needed to use, because what she had already presented had been more than enough. She held it in the flame of a match and watched it curl, blacken, then dissolve into night. There was no need to keep it any more. Justice had been done. But more importantly, she had risen without becoming the very thing she had stood against. As she stepped back onto the porch, Michael waited by the gate, hands in his pockets, head slightly bowed. She nodded to him and spoke one final sentence, more to herself than to anyone else. When a woman learns to stop hiding her strength, the world learns to stop mistaking her silence for weakness. And just like that, she closed the door, not in retreat, but in conclusion. Not to shut the world out, but to welcome the life that was finally, entirely her own. To anyone listening, remember this: silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. And being quiet does not mean you do not know what is happening. Sometimes the strongest people are those who say the least while watching the most. In this life, you don't always need to fight loud battles. Sometimes your wisdom is your weapon. Sometimes your peace is your protest. And sometimes your breakthrough is hidden in your ability to wait, watch, and move when the time is right. If someone is trying to break you, don't rush to prove them wrong. Focus on building yourself right. Let truth be your defender. Let grace be your anchor. The lies they build against you may rise like towers, but even towers crumble when their foundation is pride. If you're walking through betrayal, don't lose yourself in trying to retaliate. Don't let their darkness dim your light. Instead, strengthen your spirit, refine your purpose, and like Clara, rise, not with revenge, but with restoration. Let God be your vindicator. He knows the hearts of men. He sees what others cannot. And his timing, though sometimes slow to our flesh, is always perfect to our soul. We come before you with hearts that carry both silence and strength. For everyone listening today who has been misunderstood, mistreated, or misrepresented, Lord, be their defender. Be their voice when the world speaks lies over them. Be their peace in the chaos of betrayal. Be their light when manipulation tries to cloud their truth. Lord, we ask for the kind of wisdom that doesn't rush. Give us eyes to see what others don't. Give us the strength to stand without shouting, to walk without stumbling, and to wait without breaking. Teach us, Father, that we don't always need to react. Sometimes we just need to remain rooted in you. For every woman, man, or soul listening who has been hurt in silence, may healing find them. May dignity be restored, and may their story end not in bitterness, but in beauty. Let those who plot against them fall into the pits they've dug. Let every weapon formed rise up and fall down, powerless before your glory. Let truth rise like morning light. Let peace return like a long-lost friend. And Lord, when it is time, O God, when it is time, give us the courage to speak, to act, to walk out of every fire untouched and unashamed. Let no injustice define us. Let no betrayal break us. Let no lie outrun your truth. We are not victims. We are vessels of victory. We are not voiceless. We are full of divine purpose. So, Father, we seal this prayer in faith. We declare our healing, our peace, and our rise. In the name above every name, we say boldly, gratefully, and fully, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.